Throughout the history of the United States, several court cases have gripped the attention of the entire nation. In 1894, one such case occurred when Madeline Pollard, a young woman from Frankfort, Kentucky, sued Kentucky Congressman William C.P. Breckinridge for breach of promise. Join us today for a discussion with the KHS Research Fellow, who has written an article about Madeleine Pollard and who argues that we should see her as far more than simply a congressman's mistress, as we explore the pages of Kentucky history with Kentucky Chronicles. Kentucky Chronicles is inspired by the work of researchers from across the world who have conducted research at the Kentucky Historical Society, or who have contributed to the scholarly journal, the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, which has been published continuously since 1903. Hi, I'm Daniel J. Burge, the host of Kentucky Chronicles, a podcast of the Kentucky Historical Society. I'm the associate editor of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, and I also coordinate our Research Fellows program, which brings in researchers from across the world to conduct research in the rich archival holdings of the Kentucky Historical Society. Dr. Elizabeth DeWolfe is professor of history and co-founder of the Women's and Gender Studies program at the University of New England. She holds a PhD in history from Boston University. Her books include Shaking the Faith, Women, Family, and Mary Marshall Dyer's Anti-Shaker Campaign, 1815 to 1867, The Murder of Mary Bean and Other Stories, and Domestic Broils, Shakers, Marriage, and the Narratives of Mary and Joseph Dyer. Dr. DeWolfe was a fellow here in 2012, and in 2017, she published an article with the Register, so we are delighted to welcome her to the podcast. So welcome, Dr. DeWolfe.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today.
So for this podcast, we've been talking with folks who are at various stages of their career. And I know I've just listed a few of your many publications, but could you perhaps explain to our listeners a little more about your research, but particularly what your common themes or things you tend to focus on over your career?
Sure. As a researcher and a professor of women's history, my goal is to recover and amplify women's voices, to bring back the cultural memory of the lived experiences of women. I'm particularly drawn to everyday women. And in the projects you mentioned, what connects these women is that they were simply ordinary women leading ordinary lives until they experienced something extraordinary. A conflict with the Shakers, a pregnancy out of wedlock that resulted in death, or a national scandal with a U.S. congressman. But what I want to know is not only their extraordinary moments, their 15 minutes of historical fame, I want to know what the rest of their lives were like. And that's the theme that unites my work as a historian.
I like that. I like how you kind of draw that out, because I do think it's a challenge to always get at those sources. I know that's one of the things we're going to talk about today, but to sort of figure out, okay, who are these people, but also what have people written about them? I know that's always a challenge. We talked about this a little bit before we started recording, but I do want to dig into this. You're in Maine at the University of New England. How did you get interested in Kentucky? What sort of drew you or brought you down to Kentucky to do some research with us, and what sort of led you to the Kentucky Historical Society in particular?
Well, in my research on women's lives, it's always been important to me to get a sense of place, where these women live, where they went to school, where they worked, or even where they were buried. So when I worked on my Madeline Pollard project, which was actually my second Kentucky-based project, I did visit Kentucky for my dissertation on anti-Shakerism. But for Pollard's project, I wanted to see the context of her life. I had to go to Kentucky. So that was a fabulous opportunity. And what drew me to the Historical Society were the records on Pollard's life. I wanted to see not only the books that were written about her and the newspaper accounts, but I was also looking at primary source material to try to flesh out her life.
And that's always a challenge to do, because you have to sort of find those documents, locate them, travel. It's the one good thing about our fellowship program is we can get scholars from sort of all over the place. which has been the nice thing, bringing in people. Now, you mentioned this before. I was going to sort of come back to this. You told us a little bit about the sources that you're looking at and sort of the difficulties of some of that research. Can you tell us a little bit more about Madeline Pollard and sort of what not only led you to her, as you alluded to, but sort of what is her story? What should people in Kentucky know about her for those who might not be familiar with that particular story?
Sure. Madeline Pollard grew up in what we would call a broken home. Her father died when she was young, and that thrust her family into pretty much poverty. Her mother found it necessary to split up the family, sending 2 children to a Mason's home. The youngest child and a daughter stayed with her. And Madeline was sent to live with a succession of aunts because her deceased father, before he passed, realized that Madeline had something special. She was a voracious reader. She was intellectually motivated. And what Madeline wanted more than anything was an education. And by many different means, she got one. And when she was studying at Cincinnati Wesleyan Female College, she had made a deal with a bachelor Kentucky farmer, an older man, that if he would pay her tuition, when she graduated, she would either pay him back or marry him. Well, just a year into her education, 2 things happened. One, she realized in the thrill of education that she was not a match for a rural Kentucky farmer. Her education was expanding her mind and her dreams. The second thing happened is the farmer ran out of money and said, "Time's up, Madeline, let's get married." Now, as the story is told, by luck, Madeline Pollard was on a train and encountered a rising politician, William C.P. Breckinridge. And as this farmer pushed Madeline for marriage, Madeline reached out to Breckinridge and said, "Can you help me? I don't want to marry this man." He came to Cincinnati. They had a couple of meetings. They had a carriage ride, yada, yada, yada. They became lovers. Almost 10 years goes down the road. Madeline is now in Washington, D.C. Breckinridge is a 5-time member of the House of Representatives. His wife passes, and Madeline thinks, at last, he'll make good on his oft-repeated promise to marry. And Breckinridge up and marries someone else. And this is where Madeline goes against the norm. And this is why we need to know her, because Madeline refused to back down in the face of white male privilege. When he refused to marry her, when he married someone else, she refused to slink away in shame. She refused to take all the blame and condemnation. So she sued him for breach of promise. And this was a trial of the century in Washington, D.C. in the spring of 1894. But we should know about Madeline not just because of this court case. Because the court case, if we focus on the court case as the peak of Madeline's life, it really objectifies her. And that's not the point of this story. This is not about a woman out to take down a congressman. Because woven into her testimony in court and with the documents that capture her life in Kentucky before the scandal and her life after the scandal, we find a story of the American dream and a woman who wanted it. A life of education, of art, of culture, of travel. It sounds good to me. But Pollard's social class and gender placed enormous barriers before her. And similarly, for similarly minded women who simply wanted more than the 19th century would hand to women. So this is a story about women's ambitions. It's not a story about bringing down a man. It's a story about women struggling to be brought up. Because American society, why do we still care? Because American society today still struggles with ambitious women. Ask Hillary Clinton and Nancy Pelosi if I'm right.
No, but I think the good thing about this project is you're taking a voice that maybe we're not familiar with, but then you're really pulling on bigger themes from the 19th century. You're pulling out those ideas and sort of getting at it. One of the things I did want to ask, though, and I know you talked about this a little bit before, sources. If you're pulling on these different sort of threads that maybe haven't been looked at in the past, or as I know you talk about in the article, most of these sources are written by men. Now, they're legal documents, or else they're sort of depositions. There are these things that have been created by men that I'm sure have biases sort of baked into them. So could you tell us a little bit about that? What makes that so challenging? Because I imagine that's very difficult to tell the story of a woman in a society where, the sources are largely being crafted, or the story is being told by men.
Yeah, that is one of the biggest challenges, probably the second biggest challenge after the first one, which is simply finding these women's story, right? Because even the very nature of the story, Madeline Pollard only becomes known to us when she ends up in a court of law, right? The mill girl I studied, Breckinridge Caswell, only becomes known when a doctor's malpractice killed her. So that's challenge number one, is finding the women. But when you find them, when they intersect with the historical record, we do have to often begin with the men in their lives, family, friends, officials of some sort, right? Lawyers, businessmen. We get their records and we look for the shadows of the women in their lives. Then we work to fill in the gaps. And we can do that by being really creative with our sources. So in addition to things like letters and diaries and legal documents and vital records and the like, I also use material culture. What did they own? What would they have used? What did they read? And I read what they would have read. Maps, providing a sense of place and spatial awareness. Photographs give me a sense of the look and the feel of the past. That can help get to their lived experiences. But you're right. With this challenge, we want to get as close to the woman's lived experience as possible and find sources that are unmediated by other voices. So in my Pollard research, for example, as you know, many people wrote about her, some in support, some in indignation. But what did Pollard think? Now, she did write a few pieces. And of course, she appeared in court and spoke. But she very carefully, to use a modern phrase, curated her brand. She was clever. She was very clever. And so she knew how to present her narrative and her story to affect the result that she wanted to win in court. And indeed, she did. Getting at her unguarded moments, and those of many women, is tough. In the case of Pollard, I found some scant evidence of her life before the farmer demanded marriage, before she met Breckinridge, before she became synonymous with Mistress. Those are the moments you want to find. And those moments document her educational ambition, her charisma, and her intellectual successes. She won a big debate in Cincinnati between the various colleges. So the biggest challenge is sifting through the evidence, sifting through those voices, plotting out. I do a lot of mapping, plotting out who is closest to Pollard, what's their agenda, what do they get out of writing this piece, what's their point of view, and always, always, always asking myself, how can I access her world? It's a challenge of thinking not only outside the box, but outside other containers as well.
I really like your point too about material culture helping you get at some of that, because that is so. I think we just tend to gravitate towards diaries, letters, things that are somewhat tangible that we think, okay, this is her point of view, but your ability to sort of get those. But that does lead into another question. While you were doing research at the Kentucky Historical Society, and I like to ask this a lot, what was the coolest or most useful source that you came across?
I had such a great time, and there were so many wonderful sources. And to be honest, to prepare for this discussion today, I went back to the report I wrote, and I was reading it, and I was thinking, oh yeah, that's right. I remember the day I found that. But the coolest thing I found were multiple copies of a quickly produced book on the Breckinridge Pollard trial. And what they basically did was string all the newspaper articles together to tell the story of the court battle. And the press was rushing this into print while the scandal was on everyone's radar. It was to make a lot of money. That was their goal. Now, the Historical Society had multiple copies, hardback, paper-bound, different colored covers, so that was cool. You could see the different editions. In addition, you have in the collection the order forms for the book. So how it worked is while the trial was going on, the press produced a salesman's sample. So it's the hardback cover of the book, and inside are about 20 or 30 non-contiguous pages to show you what the book is going to look like. And then there was a subscription order form. And so agents are going around trying to get people to basically pre-order the books, just like Amazon today, right? You pre-order the book to figure out whether it's going to be a bestseller and how many copies you need to print. One of the order forms, and this was, to me, this was the coolest thing, had some advertisements attached. The press was advertising to hire women agents to sell the book, because with such a seamy scandal, you can't have male agents going door to door saying, hey, want to buy a book about a sex scandal? That's creepy. So they were looking for women agents, and that tells us not only about how they're positioning the book, but it's also another job for women. And so that to me was really just fun to find, and it was very insightful to think about the positioning and the mechanics of selling this book. So that was fun.
Scandals always interest people. I think that's a thing you can sort of see across time, is if you study 19th, 18th, whatever century you study, scandals are fascinating, but it's also interesting that they sort of can't talk about it, but they can talk about it, and it's sort of hush hush. But you know, a woman could sell that, but a guy couldn't, even though they're talking about this sort of in the open. It's fascinating. So we spent a lot of time talking about some of your past projects and what you've worked on when you were here back in 2012, what that led to, sort of the research path. I do want to quickly, before we let you go here, just hear a little bit about your current projects. What are you working on now? Does it have anything Kentucky related? Or is there anything that sort of draws on what you've seen here, or just what are you sort of up to at the moment?
Well, I am working on a book that has grown out of the Pollard research. The book is tentatively called The 10-Week Detective, and it is about a Gilded Age female undercover detective. So of the many fascinating things I learned while I was researching Madeline Pollard, the most amazing find of my research was learning that Congressman Breckinridge, desperate for some information that would help him in this court case, hired a young woman to befriend and spy on Madeline Pollard, hoping that in their heart-to-heart conversations, Pollard would spill some incriminating evidence that Breckinridge could use in the trial. And at first I thought this was a fiction, but later I learned archivally through some dogged research and lucky breaks that this in fact was true. It took me several weeks to untangle all of the aliases this woman used, but I did it and I figured out her real identity. One of my proudest achievements as a historian is to figure out her identity. And she was so good at this role that her name and her position did not come down through time, either with the Pollard story, and in fact, the archivists where her family papers, woo, another lucky break, family papers, where her family papers are housed, had no idea, zero idea. When I went to first look at the papers, they sat at the table across from me and said, no, I'm sorry, you have the wrong person. But I didn't. And so what I found was a fabulous story of a stenographer's ambition to live a self-supporting life as an urban working woman who gets this incredible opportunity and takes it. And so once again, we see a woman who wants her part of the American dream, not the dream that's handed to women, marriage, motherhood, domesticity. She wanted the dream that men got, a good job, unchaperoned travel, the choice of a single life. So like Madeline Pollard, this undercover detective wanted to live by her own decisions, to enact her own agency. In another time and place, they might have been friends, but in this time and place, they weren't. And the book, by the way, will be published by the University Press of Kentucky circa 2025.
Yes. That is excellent news. So we will all be looking out for that. That sounds like both a great topic, and UPK is great. So again, not to get them too much of a selling point, but yes, they do great stuff, and we're always excited because we always get those books in the register office and then we review them, and it's always a good sort of relationship we have with them. So I will let you go here, so I'll just close this out. That was Dr. Elizabeth DeWolfe, a professor at the University of New England. We hope that you will all check out her work, and I should add her forthcoming work now, because that, I think, whetted all our appetites for that. You can learn much more if you're interested about Madeline Pollard by reading Dr. DeWolfe's excellent article in the Register, which is entitled, quote, "More Than a Congressman's Mistress, Ambition and Scandal in the Life of Madeline Pollard." So if you are interested in that, be sure to check that out. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. DeWolfe.
Thank you. This was my pleasure.
While scandals can be juicy, we hope that today's talk has shown us that there is often more to the story than the salacious details. Women like Madeline Pollard lived complex lives and deserve to be remembered for more than a single moment. For those who are interested in learning more, I encourage you to check out Dr. DeWolfe's article, "More Than a Congressman's Mistress, Ambition and Scandal in the Life of Madeline Pollard," which was published in the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society in 2017 and is now available on Project Muse. This brings another episode to a close. I would like to thank our guest, Dr. Elizabeth DeWolfe, for talking with me today. Kentucky Chronicles is presented by the Kentucky Historical Society with support from the Kentucky Historical Society Foundation. Our show is recorded and edited by Gregory Hardison. Thanks to Dr. Stephanie Lang for her support and guidance. Our theme music is used courtesy of Pixabay. To learn more about our publication, the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, or to learn more about our Research Fellows program, please visit our website, history.ky.gov. If you have enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe. It really helps us to know how we are doing. You can also help us build a following by telling your friends to subscribe.